Within the American political left, there is a supposed separation between your average politician, the broader liberal establishment, and the militant progressives out there protesting in the streets. The organizations, the politicians, and the social advocacy groups, which oftentimes will come to define the platform of progressivism as a whole, will largely not even interact directly with the politicians or their staff. These factions, at the same time, fight for the same agenda as most of the liberals and politicians in office. However, because of this separation from the mainstream liberals, these factions are able to pursue an agenda through more radical and unfavorable means. Thus, unlike the dissident factions of the conservative movement, many of these liberal factions operate as an ideological enforcement wing for their broader movement. Even if these figures will hold elected offices, there's something that separates them from the broader liberal Democrats. In fact, many of these factions almost seem separate from politics as a whole, just creating chaos. These are the factions of the dissident left. Also, this is part 2 of a video series that I'm doing with Monsieur Z, breaking down all of the factions of the American political sphere. Last week we covered the conservative factions with the same sort of format, so if you haven't seen those, go and check those out. I'll put those in the link in the description, and I'll link them up right here. This week we're going to be covering the liberal factions, and he's going to be covering the mainstream ones, and I'm going to be covering the dissident left. Alright. Now let's move into these factions that we're talking about today. The first faction that we are going to be talking about is what is known as the Marxist faction. The Marxists are a generally factionalized group that is motivated by a general devotion to the teachings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They are defined by a firm anti-establishment position predicated upon the view that the establishment is an upholder of a fascistic status quo that's built through the hard labor of a working class. Despite their claims to be economically centered movement, the Marxists are largely focused on a broad cultural and social upheaval. You will often find the average Marxist to be very supportive of divergent sexual expression, minority empowerment, feminism, and sometimes even outright Satanism. The movement promotes a rather contrarian perspective to what the American identity might have been embodied by during the 1950s. Although historically being dominated by a working class of hard laborers, the movement's center of power has shifted to the intellectual and college-educated class as cultural Marxist ideology gained prominence within the American academia system during the 1960s, and has largely created a left-wing dominated institution. This is largely due to the faction's modern roots stemming from the Frankfurt School, and its critical theory of academia, which has come to define much of the American education system. The school, and thus the education system, became dominated by Marxist intellectuals following the Second World War. Marxist thinkers like Nancy Fraser, Wilhelm Reich, and currently Axel Honneth developed what is known as critical theory. This gave birth to the modern Marxist intellectual framework that currently exists. This has led to the faction becoming popular amongst teachers and those working in the education system. This is a very powerful position for their faction to garner support from isolated young people. While this faction primarily concerns itself with the broad interests of an oppressed class, which are rationalized to take precedence over the interests of the elite, this faction has shifted from its old perception of a material-minded economic elite to a more inherent straight white male class as the highest oppressor. Thus, they favor policies of radical upheaval of a ruling social order by exposing children to sexually divergent material, abolishing police and law enforcement, black liberationism, and the suppression of Christianity in the country. In economics, they tend to align themselves with mainstream progressives. That is, economics which heavily rely on regulating businesses, tax the rich, socialized markets, investments in civil welfare programs. Chief subjects of interest for this faction are inequality, law enforcement, immigration, and the education system. The whole broader faction is a very ideological one. Like the remnants of the alt-right faction discussed in my latest video, this faction is constantly justifying their positions through ideological interests. However, the Marxists are largely the biggest tent faction of the dissident left, which kind of serves as the test for what ideas are going to be pushed into the mainstream and which ones are going to stay in the dissident movement. However, most of the time they are not viewing issues pragmatically, but through an ideological lens of liberation. So that's the Marxist faction. Now we move into our second faction of the left. The next faction that we're going to be talking about is a very socially focused one. This faction is what I call the pink left. The pink left is made up of an assortment of feminists. radical feminists. However, these feminists have moved into a general advocacy for gender liberation that is not limited to women. They view society as dominated by men and patriarchal structures. They place an emphasis on inequality between sex and see this as an injustice. Thus, their view of the world and of history is constantly filtered through a lens of ideology of searching for lack of sameness between different genders. They are largely aligned with positions of social justice, libertarian socialism, communalism, nonviolence, and environmentalism. As well, because they view men and women as interchangeable labels constructed by societal traditions, they largely advocate for sexually divergent practices, which oftentimes overlap with those of the LGBT movement. This comes from the modern feminist movement stemming from the sexual revolution following the civil rights movement. Thus, this faction is uniquely devoted to the destruction of traditional relationships between genders. The way they see it, men and women are interchangeable. Thus, if a man wants to marry a man, he should be able to. This extends to issues of transgenderism, as they largely push for liberation from gender and nature for that matter. Additionally, this extends to non-LGBT matters, as they advocate for women to wear revealing clothing, have multiple sexual partners, engage in hookup culture, have open relationships, have promiscuous sex, and to even do sex work. They view this as something of a revolt against patriarchal societal traditions. This faction is broadly devoted to the attacking of the traditional family unit as it has existed in Western civilization. They are largely opposed to the marital structure in which the two sexes have roles in which they conform to. Additionally, they are opposed to having children, as recently they've adopted a broader position that women going through pregnancy is oppression because women are forced to carry the baby. And as you can guess, this faction is very devoted to abortion and the expansion of it. If any development ever happens with abortion, they are on the streets rioting about it and protesting. At the end of the day, their agenda consists of positions of pro-abortion, LGBT rights, women's empowerment, and a general opposition to the traditional family living. So that's the pink left, and now we move into our next faction of the left, and the next faction that we're talking about is the vision of the left that most conservatives in the media will focus on. This faction is what is called the anarchist faction. The anarchists themselves have multiple sub-factions within themselves, but for this video we'll stick to the one that shows up the most. Anarcho-communists, or libertarian socialists as they're sometimes known. They usually like to dress around like Antifa, and they'll use black bloc, which is a method to disguise themselves, and will often terrorize anyone who doesn't agree with them. This is largely because of their fundamental belief that in order to achieve progressive change, society's institutions which uphold a civilization they view as fascistic must be torn down. They largely are devoted ideologues who seek to cause chaos whenever they can get away with it. They will loot and riot in order to inspire instability for the ruling class. Anarchists don't vote or have their own party since they believe that unless the government is abolished, they will never be truly free. Their origins can be found in the Cold War when the American leftist movement was fractured between pro-Stalin coalition of nationalists and the anarchists, who capitalized upon the social movements of nihilism in the 1960s and opposed the supposed American imperialism in Vietnam. They are usually extremely pro-LGBT, anti-capitalism, anti-hierarchy, anti-authority/government, pro-gun, they hate religion and police, and essentially they want to abolish capitalism and replace it with a stateless society where everyone works communally without any form of hierarchy. Similarly to the other factions discussed, they are hostile towards any cultural establishment and generally advocate for contrarianism in order to weaken said establishment. This is probably the second most big tent faction of the dissident left, surprisingly, as they incorporate most of the agendas of the other factions. However, this is largely due to the fact that this faction simply seeks to cause as much chaos in order to weaken the current social and political order so they can usher in their own. So that's the anarchist faction. Now we move into our next faction of the left. The next faction that we're going to be talking about is probably just as militant as the anarchists. The only difference is that this faction is a much more influential faction and actually has a lot of influence over public policy and the broader liberal movement. This faction is what I call the minority supremacists. The minority supremacists are an interesting faction to discuss. On the one hand, they advocate radical overthrow of societal traditions and institutions, as they view them as institutionally racist and controlled by a conspiracy by the white man. There are multiple sub-factions within this faction, but they primarily put an emphasis on minorities, specifically blacks and Hispanics, being liberated from the white man's world. This includes through violence, as they will collaborate with anarchists in achieving their goals. In culture, they align with feminists, advocating for women to wear revealing clothing, engage in practices deemed degenerate in the past, to have multiple sexual partners, engage in hookup culture, have open relationships, have promiscuous sex, and even to do sex work, as they view this as going against the white man's culture. However, unlike the feminists, the minority supremacists have a heavy in-group bias, and thus a pro-family position. Anyone who resembles what they deem as family is part of that organ that operates as a faction. In politics, they lobby primarily for the weakening of law enforcement, and want to have police completely out of the way. They justify this by suggesting that police are inherently anti-black and seek to uphold white society. Additionally, they favor progressive policies of affirmative action and diversity quotas designed to keep whites out of various institutions. This breeds a sentiment of resentment for white success in many of the minority supremacists, as they view all prosperity of white people as being built off of perceived historical labor of non-whites. While historically minority supremacists were guided by a common involvement in the church and or Christian Southern Baptist traditions, this has largely shifted in recent years. Many minority supremacists have abandoned their Christian or Catholic traditions in exchange for a further embracing of their native cultures. Many will embrace pagan or tribalistic folk culture through music, apparel, art, and so on. Others will embrace Islamic tradition and or broadly anti-Christian cultures as a revolt against the white civilization. The faction has its roots in Malcolm X's neo-Jacobinite vision for the Black Pride movement, and its revival under Fred Hampton's Black Panther Party. While this faction primarily concerns itself with minority interests, which are rationalized to take precedence over the white interests because they believe that whites are already catered to, and will view virtually all policies through a lens of a racial scope. The nature of this faction is seen in groups like a Nation of Islam, Black Panther Party, Black Power Movement, Black Liberation Army, and Black Lives Matter. Key figures include Ibram X. Kendi, Eric Adams, Barbara Smith, and more. So that's the minority supremacist faction. Now we move into our last faction of the American left. This one is a very interesting one. It is probably the most niche faction that we're going to be talking about here, as this is really the only one that does not have a tangible influence over public policy. This lack of influence is due to their isolation from the rest of the left, and them being viewed as sort of a black sheep of the left. This faction is what I call the industrial left, and what they call MAGA communists. The industrial left has recently been trending on Twitter, promoting the hashtag MAGA communism. They call themselves MAGA communists, and the movement is a very online one, which has already allowed to get popular on Twitter. The term MAGA communism was coined by a figure in their movement, Jackson Hinkle, who got an interview on OAN. The movement's key social figures are internet streamer Haas Infrared, Jackson Hinkle, and Caleb Maupin. The industrial left are a breakaway faction from the synthetic left from the 1960s, and they view the modern left, this synthetic left, the anarchists, and the general Marxist left as a psyop designed to take away the masculine and worker focus previously present in the movement, to be replaced with a liberal feminine movement of manufactured social issues like gender and sexuality. As a result of this, they have been hated by virtually the entire left, because they believe that the MAGA movement is the real working class movement, and that they should work with MAGA people instead of calling them fascists. Unlike many other leftists who are anti-capitalist but pro-capitalism spreading degeneracy, the industrial left are all anti-capitalist and anti-degeneracy. They view things like the LGBT movement and social justice movements of a globalist bourgeois undermining of the workers' socialist movement. Thus, they are anti-capitalist, and they favor a very unique platform that argues for dismantling of big tech, monopolies, big pharma, and the nationalization of the steel and oil industries. All in all, their platform resembles a platform of socialism in one country. Thus, they are incredibly critical of the globalism, especially as it currently exists, to spread liberalism. As a result, the industrialists oppose supranational organizations like NATO and the United Nations. This has manifested itself in their support for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, as they view Russia as the main opposition to Western liberalism, maintaining an iron fist over the world. Additionally, they vehemently oppose immigration, as they view mass immigration as the result of elites getting cheap labor to take jobs from the American working class, thus lowering their wages. The MAGA communists hold a sense of nostalgia in wanting to make it possible for a man to raise his family on one single income like in the 1950s. Their political ambitions largely seek an outlet through the invigoration of a working class who they observe to be a part of the MAGA movement. This is seen in their platform, which largely mirrors that of the right-wing industrial populist movement. They want to promote made-in-America products, promote patriotic education, ban pornography and obscene materials, lower taxes. The MAGA communists have a perceived nationalistic view of America, and they want to reindustrialize and promote made-in-America products, dismantle big pharma and big tech, abolish the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, ban drugs, secure the border, and ban Antifa terrorism. They have a love for America and its people, and hate those that wish to destroy it. To them, if you're a communist that doesn't support MAGA, they see you as a traitor to the working class. All in all, a very interesting faction that could be a change for the left if this faction becomes more influential and popular. the American political left is much more than the media will make them out to be. The media will often portray these broad political movements as something of a united front. The reality is that the American political sphere is made up of two big tents under which various interest groups are fighting for influence. They want their goals to be pursued. They want their constituency to be taken care of. They want their voices to be heard. They want their faces to be the faces that you think of when you think of the American political left. These are the groups which make up the American political left. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Support the Wolfpack by donating or join by subscribing for more content like this. I'll see you next time, Wolfpack.